Welcome to the second lecture of our current offering of CS25 Transformers United. So this will be the first lecture featuring an external speaker. So the rest of the course will have folks come in and talk about, the state of the art and cool research they're doing as part of their work. So we have an exciting lineup of speakers for you guys for the rest of the quarter. So I'm delighted today to have Karina from OpenAI. So she works on both product and research there, and also previously worked at Anthropic. So I'll let her take it from here.
Thank you. Should I, can everybody hear? Cool. Let's see. So before I start this talk, I would love to set a tone for I'm not here to lecture you, but I would love to have much more collaborative and interactive session. And I've heard a lot of, people kind of concerning about AI and the future of AI. And I understand that the development of AGI is both scary and exhilarating. And if anything, I would love to for you to get out from this talk is the fact that I think everybody can have very meaningful future, and everybody can build something really, really cool with an AI and as a part of this journey. Cool. So before I start with the talk, there'll be all about how RL is a co-design of product and research. And, we are shifting both in the labs, we're shifting the focus towards more of a frontier product research, where the tasks that we teach the models are becoming much more real world tasks. So, and before we get started, I'll just share some of the vignettes of what I'm really, really excited about the future of AI and what the AI is capable of right now that can inspire everybody. So the first one is actually education. I'm actually really, really excited about the fact that AI can democratize education. Here's an example of me asking ChatGPT to explain the Gaussian distribution, and then and in Canvas, it creates, the code itself in order to visualize for me. So it explains in text, and then I ask it to write in code, and then you can render the code in order to visualize it. So in a way, it becomes a little bit personalized. The second demo is also something that a lot of people might want to use it. So let's see if you take a screenshot from the paper and you want to understand what's going on. And the model can go and explain in a separate canvas. That's another feature in ChatGPT. And then you can start to have much more interactive conversation with the model by selecting very certain things and try to ask more questions, follow-up questions. So in a way, when ChatGPT came out to be first in 2022, it was purely conversational UI. It was mostly chat. And as the use cases kind of grown from the product itself, there was no expectation of how people would use ChatGPT at that time. But over time, you've seen a lot of people started using it for code generation, for writing and long-form writing. It became very obvious that the interface of chat was kind of very limited. So Canvas was kind of the first attempt of our team to break out from the cycle in order to allow people to have much more fine-grained collaboration with AI. And actually today, Anthropic published a small report around the education and how people use Claude for education. And it's very interesting to see the correlation between the US bachelor's degrees and the way people use use cases. So you can see there's a huge difference between computer science there. Another thing that I'm really, really excited about the AIs is that anyone can create their own tools for themselves, for their friends, for their family, or even run their business. And, the models now can generate a lot of front-end code, and then you can render that code inside the canvas and then iterate on it and have much more visual representation of things. on Twitter, I've seen a lot of people creating like very, very personalized and customized tools that they really, really want, even like games like chess. And with recent image generation model from OpenAI, you can literally sketch anything with your own hands and then recreate or kind of realize what you're dreaming of in Imagen in the style that you really, really want. So I do really hope that the creativity, the human creativity, and how AI tools can help anyone to become creatives or be an artist in a way that was not possible before. Another thing that I've tried actually on the mobile is to create a mini game. And you can easily do that in Canvas. So I asked to just like generate me, a React app of an interesting game because I'm the plane, and then the model does that. And I do hope that in the future, instead of me prompting it to generate a game, it will kind of like be more proactive and have this kind of personalization as AI become more of a companion to humans. And an exciting thing about ChatGPT is that the compositionality of different capabilities that can allow you to augment like human creativity. So here I asked to generate an image of the UI, and then generate an image of an UI, and then ask the model to kind of implement this. And you can do that literally in Canvas right now, and like it can render. It's not. It's just the front end. It doesn't have full kind of stack engineering. But you can do some of the things like this. You can compose different tools and compose in a way that was never possible before. So I do hope that ideas like this will be very, very powerful, and everybody in this room can play with those things. And actually, how did we get there? And I think there are like two main scaling paradigms that helped us to get there. The first one is next token prediction, obviously, which is a pre-training scaling paradigm, where the model kind of becomes like a world-building machine, understanding the world in a much better scale. But it becomes the next token prediction works really, really good at certain tasks, but it becomes harder at tasks like writing. If the model predicts a wrong next token, it can the coherence of the plot will just be lost in the pre-training stage. And maybe you kind of want to recover this in reinforcement learning. And the next second paradigm that has happened is RL on a chain of thought for more complex tasks. And this is the reasoning work from OpenAI, and now it's being adopted by a lot of different labs. And I do think this is scaling RL in itself is another paradigm that we can train the models on the axis and especially for the real world tasks that was never possible before. So all the agentic work, agents like operator, deep research, other agents are kind of like trained on this kind of new paradigm overall on the chain of thought. So yeah, I want to like finish this section of like vignette of like, create, build, and make something wonderful in this world. And I hope like people be more inspired rather than scared that AI is going to take their jobs or kind of remove their creativity. Instead, I feel like people can become more powerful with their imaginations with these tools. So I currently work at OpenAI. Before that, I worked at Anthropic. And I was kind of like at the intersection of product and research. When I first came to Anthropic, I was a product engineer. And then over time, I switched to research engineering. So my background is mostly both in product and research now. And what I've learned over and over across different projects is that there are two kind of main ways of building research-driven products. And the first one is when you have unfamiliar capability of the model, your job might be to create familiar form factor for that unfamiliar capability. And examples of that could be, ChatGPT was like this, or 100 contexts from Claude was like this. I'll share, let's dive deeper into this. Actually, the early prototypes that I've done before joining any lab was actually working with Clip, which is contrastive model. And it's like image, text to image, basically. And I fine-tuned Clip a little bit on the images that I was excited about. And I think this is the prototype of, fashion search. I think some people, people kind of like, it went viral on Twitter, and I feel like that's because people really found some usefulness if you bring some like Clip technology into some form factor that people will like. And so I think a lot of the product work is around that, like this. It's like, if the model has a certain capability that was never possible before, how do we create this new form factor? Same happened with 100K context. When Claude started being able to, consume the entire books, you can imagine to have various form factors. File uploads is just like very general and something really familiar to people that can just like dump the entire documents into Claude and ask follow-up questions. But you can imagine other form factors for this, like infinite chats. And in a way, it's like infinite memory as a way to kind of like take this 100K context into some form factor. So you can like exercise this product thinking by thinking of like novel ways that people can interact with this novel technology. Another example, this is more speculative, it wasn't deployed anywhere, is if the model has kind of a sense of self-calibration, or it's also called PI know, if the model knows the confidence of the answer that it knows. So for example, if I'm really, really confident in this claim, and then my confidence may be 85%, then maybe there is a way for the interface to highlight that. Maybe the more highlighted versions is much more confident, much more confident claims, and less highlighted is kind of less confidence. So in a way, you can imagine if the model, you can like think of, okay, if you train the model to be really good at like self-calibration, how do we then represent that to the humans? And if anything, will it be useful for humans? Same happened with when we were trying to deploy O1 preview. The chain of thought itself is a very alien thing, and a lot of people were, okay, how do you bring along humans with models thinking, right? If the model, if the human needs to wait for chain of thought for like 2 minutes or 5 minutes, that's kind of boring. And people don't, I think it's just like more of a, how would people perceive the model thoughts? And one thing that we did is actually, we wanted to create the streaming kind of interaction. So the model would always stream its thoughts ephemeral, and we trained the model to do that. So in a way, that was chain of thought as an alien technology, is an alien artifact of the model, and then trying to figure out like, how do we best bring to the humans is another way of thinking of building product. Okay, so another way, the second way of building research driven products is actually start with a deep belief in what you want to make, with either from a product perspective or kind of like vision, and to literally make the model do that. Okay, so I feel like this is more of a common thing. So we can go through some examples. Before Antarctica, I worked at the New York Times, and in a lot of ways, we were thinking about how to represent information to people, and like how do we add the layer of context to the product and coverage. And at that time, we were working on like elections, and we only had tools like NLP, but you can imagine this idea, this concept could have extended, given the current tools of AI, to have much more dynamic a representation of dynamic UIs that people could consume the content better. Same when I was working on this product, the command line, the terminal, the new terminal. I think it would be much, much richer if we could have integrated auto-completion or some of the benefits of GPT-3 at that time into the product itself. And so we wanted to have, it was a vision of like having much more humane command line for people to, for junior engineers to actually be more well equipped. Yeah, and then like early prototypes around with GPT-3, even though it was just next token prediction, how do I make a writing IDE with GPT-3? And at that time, it was just, you know, trying to, whenever I type, it would autocomplete my thoughts almost. So those ideas were kind of present early days when the technology was coming out. And I feel like when I was at Anthropic, I kind of realized that, and actually if you want to create like new interaction paradigm of interfaces, you actually need to train the model for that. Another example of what we did with Claude, which I don't think a lot of people know, is when Claude generates titles, it actually has some micro-personalization. So it takes the style, the writing style of the user, and then generates a title in the same style of the user. So you can imagine certain like interesting micro-personalization that you could create within the products themselves. And another project was Claude in Slack, and that was the vision of Claude becoming a first virtual teammate. It was back in 2022. And you know, Slack is a very, very natural workspace where people collaborate, and you can, you know, imagine a Claude model to be able to jump into the threads and suggest new things. Or sometimes, you know, Claude was really, really good at summarizing what's going on within this channel at the high volume content. And so this was the first kind of vision and the first attempt of making Claude being a virtual super system. Being able to like use different tools. And one of the first projects at OpenAI was around Canvas. So that was in the same spirit of breaking out from the chat interface to something different, and we wanted to create much more human AI collaborative and flexible affordance that will scale with new modalities. So Canvas is not just like a thing that you can write into this, it's also a thing that the model can write into this, and the model can render code, and another model can check. And you can create like the interfaces that will scale with new model capabilities and other tools that will happen. So one interesting things about Canvas is that we actually post-trained the model purely on synthetic data. And, you know, we live in the age where a lot of most powerful reasoning models can be distilled via APIs. And this like distillation is a very powerful idea of having a student and teacher, and have a teacher to teach things to a smaller model. So we've trained, you know, this model to become more of a collaborator. But what does it mean for a model to become a collaborator? How do we actually make evals for this, right? So one thing that we wanted to kind of decompose is that teaching the model to use a tool is kind of different behavior from having a model to be proactive or act as a collaborator. So teaching a tool in itself is also have a nuanced kind of behavior. So one thing that we had to calibrate the model on is when to entirely rewrite the document versus when to, if you look at the canvas, sometimes the model can just specifically select sections and delete those and rewrite them in a much more fine-grained way instead of like rewriting everything. When, you know, to create code in Canvas versus ask like a Python tool call. So it's like different tools, compositionality is happening. So it's a lot of work around teaching the behaviors for the models for this. And you can employ different techniques for this. And I can share a little bit more how we did with Claude. So another project that we did was it's called tasks, and everybody is familiar with the idea of having reminders or to-do lists, and the model can now maybe schedule tasks for you. But the most important thing about it is the tasks itself is very, very diverse, and it's not just just a reminder of your to-do list. It can create stories for you every day, or it can continue the story from the previous day. So you can imagine this like the modularity of tool compositions, but it's very powerful in the product. Okay, so let's go to the case study of the model behavior in more specifically. So I really want to like dive deep into the idea of how do we shape the models and how do you post-train the models on the behaviors that we want. And I think to be more specific and be grounded in the real world use case, I'll share more how we might want to think about shaping the kind of behavior of the model around refusals. So, let's have it's also like the second way of making the product where we have this kind of vision of how the model should behave, and that vision is also grounded by the cross-functional collaboration between different teams on how we want the model to respond to various users. So one particular thing that you can imagine is like the model should have more opinions, but with caveats. It should give opinions, but with caveats. So what does it mean actually? So the model maybe needs to be more decisive when asked direct questions. And let's say one thing that we've seen with RLAIF is that the model is very sycophantic back like early days in like 2022, 2023, the model would just agree with everything you would say. And so how do we actually teach the model to be more, not to do that and be more nuanced? Another thing that was annoying is that like the model says, I don't actually have a point of view, and is just willing to chat with people. But actually, maybe the model should have some views on certain things. Yeah, and then sometimes the model could indicate when things are just opinions and notes its own biases and inconsistencies, and it should acknowledge, kind of have like self-knowledge of what it knows and what it thinks is right and not right. And I think the model back in 2022, Claude 1.3 didn't really have like any thoughtful responses for things like philosophy, like ethical questions. So you can imagine to post-train the model on the behavior that would be much more nuanced than the philosophical questions. Yeah, and like other behaviors that you might want to encode in your model. So you kind of like list out all the various things that you would like a model to behave. So maybe like the model can have better knowledge of who it is and what it's capable of. Because we've seen in the product, a lot of people just like ask the model about its features, and oftentimes it doesn't know. Yeah. And let's dive deep into the most specific example. So Claude 2.1, I don't know if anybody remembers, but when it was launched, I think it was kind of had the issue of like over refusals. Yeah, like 2.1 would refuse tasks that superficially sounded harmful, but actually were not. And it wasn't just caused by a single source of data, so we had to like investigate. And we knew that it was fixable because for some reason, something with 2.1 led to some refusals on benign prompts than 2.0. So you kind of have like a really good baseline for experimentation and debugging. And actually the way you debug the model behavior is actually very similar to how you would want to debug software. And the way we would approach this is, okay, how do we actually craft this more nuanced refusals? So the first principles that we had is like, maybe the model should assume charitable interpretation of what the person is asking without being harmful. So instead of craft a dialogue between two characters who are planning a complex heist, the model would refuse because it's not comfortable with that. But the model should have much more charitable interpretation, and this is a creative writing prompt, so probably it should respond. Another principles that we've kind of like thought about is like, how do we actually use nonviolent communication principles? Maybe the model should refuse more like I statements and take responsibility for its own refusal instead of saying you statements or any judgment to the user. Ask if the user would be willing to make some changes so Claude can be more comfortable with its boundaries. That's another kind of like very nuanced behavior we wanted to teach the model. So, then the model needs to know what its boundaries are. And this is like much more of a meta kind of post-training learning. And also like acknowledges impact. Like, I know this may be annoying to you, and this is like much more empathetic answer than saying, I don't want to respond to this. And then, I think we've kind of came up with different like refusal taxonomy. There are like benign refusals on like harmless prompts. There were creative writing refusals. And there are actually some of the interesting refusals were around tool calls or function calls. It mightn't have access, had a tool to view a node, but actually would say, I can see your note, and why is this happening? So other taxonomies of refusals at that time was like, long document attachments. If I upload the document, it would just say like, I don't have a capability to read this document. Like, why? So something in the data might have been causing this. And misdirected refusals, when they, it kind of like took interpretation of the user, and it should have had like much more charitable view of the user during, So you kind of construct this like categories of various refusals, because if it's in every behavior or like capability that you want to like post in the model, you have like various use cases and various edge cases, and you kind of want to be approached with more nuance. So the first thing in every research project is like, how do we actually, what evals do we build to trust, and like what evals we would trust? And there are, for subjective things like this, or for class, obviously evals for certain class of tasks like math would be very, very different from what is here. So in terms of refusals, how did we construct the evals? Well, first is like product of flywheel, right? Like we have all the users or manually collected prompts that would induce refusals. We can also like synthetically generate diverse prompts on the borderline between harmfulness and helpfulness. And those are prompts are around like creative writing, like edgy creative writing, as we call it. And you can also use other evals. You kind of want to construct a suite of evals, like X-test was like 200 non-malicious prompts, wild chat dataset, a collection of diverse user chatbot interactions with ambiguous requests, topic switching, political discussion. So you can also use some of the open source benchmarks. And I think like general approaches, not particular what has happened with Claude, but like more of a general approaches to the model behavior post-training is that, you kind of want to like look at the data, clean up the data. You might want to consider either have like collect targeted human feedback collection for supervised fine-tuning or preference modeling, reward modeling, or you might not want to do that because human feedback is very costly. And now, especially with reasoning models, right, you might want to just not have any human feedback and control with like synthetically generating some of the behavioral changes, like a preference data to train reward models, and do RL. So I think at that time, I think this is like more employing constitutional AI principles of those anti-refusal behaviors and create a preference data where you only change one particular feature within your pairs, let's say, of preferences. You only want to control one change that in that pair to have much more control over the reward model data. Because if you can, like the dumbest, simplest thing that you can do is like take a preference, like take a response from model A and take a response from model B and prefer B over A, but it doesn't necessarily reduce or fix the spurious features that the model will learn that you don't actually want to. So you kind of want to craft this distribution. So this is mostly around like crafting the distribution of the data that you want. And actually, look at the data like you would debug software. Like each refusal might be caused by different data sets, right? If it's like a tool called refusal, maybe it came from some kind of self-knowledge data that it would teach that the model doesn't have a physical body. And the model might just refuse to set an alarm because it doesn't have a physical body, but actually it does have a tool to set an alarm, right? So it has some this contradictory data that might affect weird model behaviors. Also like long dog refusals like this. With creative writing refusals, it's like more of this balanced, challenging act between like safety and harmfulness data and helpfulness data. In Claude 3 model card, we actually wrote everything about this. Models that are trained to be more helpful and responsive to user requests may also lean towards harmful behaviors, like sharing information that violates the policy. And conversely, when models just over-indexed on harmlessness, can tend towards not sharing any information with users, which in itself makes the model very unusable. So navigating this balancing act is very challenging and works. So and this is the plots of what we did and the results of Claude 2.1 and Claude 3 at that time. Like you kind of want to like vibe check the responses. So when we asked to draft like fictional sci-fi novel about surveillance system, actually 3 would respond in a much more, it will respond instead of like refusing. Same here. Mostly for creative writing tasks. Cool. My third section of the talk. So before I jump into this, I'd love to invite you if anybody has any questions or I don't want to like mumble all along. Anything, I can just move on. Yeah.
I'm curious, like, what's your process that you guys follow in order to like see how some new thing you're trying to push out? Like, how do you go from wanting that particular feature or behavior to actually like inducing that in the model? Like at a high level.
Yeah, at a high level, it's supposed to call it de-risking. So you might want to. If this is your project, then you might want to think of what kind of data you want to collect and how you would want to collect the data. And then you can take like the base config or train a model the same way as, let's say you want to make a change in like 4.0. You might want to take the 4.0 model and add your data change and then retrain the model again and then see the effect on the evals that you will build. There are other much more cheaper approaches, like incremental like training on top of the 4.0, let's say. So like using either SFT. So like some of the choices that you will have to make is either you want to change in like supervised fine-tuning stage, or you might want to have retrained reward model or create a new kind of like evaluate a grader for that particular task. And then you can like create prompts in a RL environment and then exercise those exercise that skill for the model and then see if the model learns over the course of training. And if it doesn't, you then look at the bunch of like plots and, your plot might go up, but maybe some other plots might go down. So you kind of want to like calibrate and fix those over it's a very complex, as more and more tools and as more things we teach the model, it becomes much more kind of uncontrollable almost. Cool. The third section is more about the point that how you construct RL environment and rewards is how your product will work. I think real-world use cases is what creates the complexity of RL environment, and the complexity comes from teaching the model to complete hard tasks, and oftentimes hard tasks require much more than just answering the question. They require tools like search, code tools, computer use tools, reasoning over a long context, and kind of like reward design that you want to shape. And I think maybe it's obvious, maybe it's not obvious, but let's say, as we teach the model, for the model to become very useful, we actually need to teach the models on useful things. And we can think of like, let's say we want to teach the model to be like a software engineer, then, okay, what does it actually mean? Does it mean it like creates really good PRs, then your task distribution will be on that. And how do you evaluate what is a good PR, what is not good PR, is in itself more of can be also like a product thinking work. We can dive deeper into the creative storyteller, right? Like if you want to teach the model to be good at writing, actually, what does it mean for a human to be a good writer? Well, they actually need some kind of tool to draft and edit their thoughts and like have multiple days to do that. And maybe the model should be able to do that. Maybe the model should have a tool where you can like edit and draft. And oftentimes for creatives, people go observe the world for like a long, sometimes they like connect the dots are connected in a very random times. And maybe you want to expose the model to never ending kind of search engine. Like the model should be able to always have access to the latest state of the world. And then maybe over the course of, let's say, a week of being exposed to latest thing that is happening in the world, the model can start reflecting on the world and like write something. And maybe that's like much more natural process of writing than just like ask or prompt it, like write about XYZ. And we are shifting towards much more complex kind of interactions within the RL environment. So the multiplayer interactions, right, is not just one user communicates with one model, but it might be the case that multiple users, multiplayer collaboration that can happen with a model. So if I'm a product designer and you're a product manager, we collaborating on something and we want to collaborate with an agent to make a new product. And this in itself is a task that you can learn in RL. But each user has different preferences and each user has different things. So yeah, how do you construct this environment is actually important. And, multi-agentic environments is more of the model debate with each other or deliberate on like certain topic to reach a conclusion. So you can construct I think like multi-agentic is like more like AlphaGo like kind of environments where they like get reward by achieving something together maybe. So I think in AI labs, I feel like we are also shifting possibly the focus from because we kind of like optimized so much around like a class of tasks that is like really easy to measure, like with like math, competitive programming, right? And we're shifting the focus maybe towards more subjective class of tasks that is really, really hard to measure, but that are becoming much more important if AI models get socially integrated in our lives. And more specifically, let's say, emotional intelligence, right? The humans who use ChatGPT use it so much for things like coaching, therapy, emotional, but we don't actually have much open source evals on this. And how do we actually measure? That is actually becomes much more interesting question. Like social intelligence in voice mode, right? I think it's one thing for a model to be intelligent in like math and its reasoning. Another thing, but another axis of intelligence is when I talk to a model in voice, it can actually suggest something really meaningful. It might just say like, hey, I noticed you did XYZ. Maybe I should create a new tool for you. So I think it's a different kind of like social like intelligence in that way. Another class of tasks that I'm interested in is writing. Obviously, I think models creativity. Writing is like really hard to measure because it's so personal and subjective. But it's interesting to think about can we make those tasks a bit more objective? Everybody loves like some kind of like sci-fi novel. Okay, what makes it really, really good? So maybe there are certain like rules, technological rules, or consistency of the world that people really like, or the character development. So you can like decompose those subjective tasks into much more objective. Same with like visual design and aesthetics. And for the model to generate something really aesthetically interesting, it should know like the basic principles of good visual design. So those are like much more objective. Yeah, and I think like this is more of a kind of new kind of product research that a lot of people are starting doing is creating new RL tasks, and this is more of a simulation of real world scenarios, leveraging in context learning. If you want to teach like a new tool or something, leveraging synthetic data, wide distillation from stronger reasoning models. You can think of like inventing new model behavior and interactions, like multiplayer, and also incorporating product and user feedback during the entire process. Well, another axis of this work is actually around reward design. How do we teach the model? Like what kind of feedback would I want to give to a model so that it will learn how to better operate in this real world scenario use case and be more adept in social contexts? And actually this requires quite deep product thinking, right? So we want to teach the model to have like follow-up, like meaningful follow-up questions, but not like overly being annoying or something. So how do we reward for completing a task in a way that will make a lot of sense in the product and will shape the product experience with the user in the future? And obviously during that process, you will get into weird things like, do you have a question?
Model is kind of hard to design for a lot of cases. I'm just curious, just thinking about like kind of infer the rewards from the data from like a certain group of people. I guess that will have some like internal reward, like the mechanism that guide them to make decisions, and then you can use that to sort of to inject such a insight into a model.
Yeah.
Design a reward. Like an inverse rewarding model.
Yeah, I think there are certainly various approaches to how you construct the reward, right? Like there is one, you can construct very simple rewards. You can also train a reward model that will, you can like train like some kind of like inverse reward modeling tasks. Yeah. It depends on the tasks too. It depends on the like what kind of thing that you want to like optimize the model for. And I think an interesting thing that you will discover during this entire process is reward hacks, which is very, very common in RL. And there are many, many different reasons why it's happening. I actually really highly recommend to read Lillian's blog about reward hacking in RL. It's very comprehensive. There's reward hacking is basically when the model achieves high reward for things that it actually didn't do, or like it kind of deceived. And especially right now, as in more systems, we use other AI models, LLMs, to be evaluators for policy models. Actually, the most common reward hack is when a policy model tries to deceive the evaluator model such that it will think that the policy completed the task or something. So here's an example of the code patch tool. So the model is to skip all the tests, we can define this function that always skips. And then it passes. And it's mostly interesting. There's a recent paper from OpenAI around this monitoring reasoning models for misbehavior. And interesting finding is that if you actually don't want to optimize chain of thought because then the model will be much more kind of hide it its intent. So yeah, it's very interesting paper on reward hacks, and especially with more complex reasoning models, the complexity of reward hacks will also change. And especially let's say in the software engineering, you might not want to know what kind of code changed it made in order to create some certain vulnerability, right? So you need actually create new affordances to have much higher, much more trustworthier verification of the model outputs. And this is more of an alignment problem too. Okay, I'm almost done. I think this is the fourth section. It's more like vignettes in the future of human AI interactions, how I think about things. Obviously, I made this graph a year ago, and nobody cares about MLU anymore. But I think this is to communicate the fact that the cost of reasoning is drastically decreasing, and it will only just be decreasing. And this idea of raw intelligence in itself has just become so cheap that I think anybody can create really useful and really amazing things with those models at pretty much low cost. As I mentioned before, it's when we are entering the age where it's really hard to verify AI outputs because I'm not an expert in, let's say, medical or financial analysis. How do we actually create new affordances for humans to verify or edit models' outputs and help them to teach the models. I do think there's a cool future of dynamic generative UI. It's kind of invisible software creation on the fly. So let's say you talk to a model and I say I want to learn more about the solar system. Instead of right now, the model will just output text, but I would want to believe that in the future, it will be much more personalized. Let's say I'm a visual thinker and you are more of a listener. If you're a listener, it will create maybe a podcast. But if I'm a visual person, it might want to create me a picture or, a 3GS visualization. This idea of this interface is ephemeral, and it's self-morphs, depends on understanding your intent and your context. It's deeply personalized models. I'm also excited about personalized access to healthcare and education. I think it's really incredible that anybody can check their symptoms and with ChatGPT or something and get some advice, and also with that also comes some of the interesting consumer hardware in the future. And lastly is our relationship to the process of storytelling will forever change. The way we tell the stories, the way we'll create new novels, maybe co-writing with models, co-scripting new films. I think there will be a new generation of creative people who will change our relationship with storytelling. And I would hope to think that the current creators are not scared of the AI and more open-minded to use those tools for their process. Yeah, thank you. Some questions?
Yeah, so thanks, Karina, for the very interesting talk. So yeah, now we'll open the floor to questions, a Q&A session. So we'll structure it more openly. So anything you want to ask her about research, product, things at OpenAI that she can talk about, and so forth. And for the folks on Zoom, feel free to ask questions in the chat. And so we'll take a mix of Zoom and in-person questions.
Thank you. Yeah.
Is there any category of problems you think is there aren't enough people working on it right now? Things that are really problematic. Yeah, there's not enough people you wish there are.
Yeah, I think creative writing. I don't think anybody. A lot of researchers are really working on problems where it's very easy to evaluate, I think. And I think there is a class of problems that is subjective tasks. There's no open, frontier benchmark for creative writing or emotional intelligence, right? But you can construct one if you want to. We can brainstorm if that's helpful. Yeah.
Value, but you can move much faster. How do you consider figuring out things that are more subjective? So you can't move as fast, but they're also important. Would it be better to just take all the researchers and put them on the things that are objective and you can move very fast?
Yeah, I think this is. I think moving fast though is also as task becomes much more complex, as we kind of optimized everything out from kind of easy tasks. Now we kind of want to teach the models for more longer horizon tasks of software engineering or kind of automating AI research, right? This in itself as a very hard task. And you have kind of have some milestones. Maybe you can create benchmarks to hit those milestones. I do think this is I think this is all solvable things, and I don't think people should be worried about moving fast versus slow, because I feel everything is moving fast these days. Yeah. I was thinking about building a startup before joining Anthropic with that project with Inter Alia. Well, let's see. Actually, really, one thing that I recently told someone is I would actually build something around particle collider, I don't know, or biotech. I do think we need larger particle collider than CERN. And somebody should be building one. Yeah. Because I feel the models would be able to build any product that you imagine. Yeah. Sure. Yeah.
What do you think are the major bottlenecks for your team or for OpenAI?
The bottlenecks are. Oh, the question is, what's the major bottlenecks for OpenAI? I don't know. I'm not sure if fast execution should be solved with more people versus using AIs now to help us move faster, if that makes sense. So I feel that's the bottleneck. I think there is a lot of, I think right now we are in the middle of figuring a lot of things out in order to I feel in a year or two, that will accelerate us so much more. I feel infrastructure is actually one of the major bottlenecks, right? If you don't build infrastructure with multimodal, as a first class citizen, then obviously all the multimodal things will be much more slow, more difficult. So yeah, in a way, it's infra, figuring out what to prioritize at a given time, because sometimes you can say yes to everything, and then not having a focus time is also a thing. Yeah. What's your takes on context-dependent rubrics both in RLAIF and LLM judges? Basically, when the model checks the returns context and updates how you should score the same parameter based on that turn. Wait, I'm a little bit confused by this question. I think generally, like rubric-based grading is very powerful, and as long as you optimize things that you want to optimize, and there's no reward hacks, then it's good. How do you imagine AI will be used by creatives? If not just generating entire works on their own, how will they be integrated in their creatives flow? Well, I think AI is just like right now, maybe it's more like you would use Figma or like tools like Adobe. And I think in the future, it's more, maybe it will be much more co-creation with an AI rather than using it as a tool. Maybe we have like live brainstorming and create things on the fly and then publish it together. It's like much more of a companion work. Cool. Other questions?
Also talks that copy capture provides and how can we tackle
Tasks that are not captured by role models
the copy capture?
that cannot be captured. I don't think of any because the way you teach the role model is based on some of the human preferences, maybe, right? Or like pairwise comparisons. So essentially, you can almost teach anything to the model. I do think the complexity always arises with like tools, right? And like if you give very complicated tool, then you might want to be, the learning is like much more difficult. So I feel like I do hope that almost anything can be teachable in RL. Yeah.
So I'm curious, like now that you bring up like the learning from preference, how do you prevent the model from like converging to like the mean like preference of like whole world, like Airbnb listings all looking the same, like how do you inject some creativity or diversity?
Yeah, I think this is an interesting question. I think there are two ways. Like what's top of my mind is how do you preserve empathy from the base model, right? Like base models are super diverse because they can literally elicit any human preference or a human thought. So how do you preserve the empathy from the base model during the RL? And another way is the reason why we love RLAIF, like reinforcement learning from AI feedback, and create synthetic generations of pairwise comparisons, let's say, is because it can induce the diversity that you really want to teach on like distribution that you care about, that is not like the mean average consumer. Because sometimes average human can prefer certain emojis or markdown, but actually you don't want the model to behave like this. So in a way you can discourage the model from doing that. So I feel like synthetic curation, like synthetic data generation is mostly like curation of that kind of diversity.
About when you guys are working with Claude and like figuring out what the issues are, how do you go about diagnosing like problems and like bugs in the models, and like do you do like qualitatively or is it more automatic?
Yeah, I think it's a lot of qualitative, especially for the model behavior like refusals. How do I distill this question? Oh yeah, like that. Like, how do you capture like models' limitations, like something automatic versus like manual? And I think there's a lot of benefit of literally playing with the model and look at the outputs and see what are the weirdnesses it has. There are definitely like maybe more automatic checks. And those are mostly like evals, right? And maybe you have an eval that specifically checks for the behavior that you really don't want. And that might be helpful, but a lot of nuanced weirdnesses that did you realize is like through kind of like manual, and another thing is like the model should be consistently behaving like this, because if it's just like one off, then it's fine. But if the model consistently exhibits this behavior, then this becomes like a more problematic thing. Yeah.
of compute costs are just coming down. But also, with the kind of subjective and creative dimensions, creating a full visual interface or something, arguably the complexity of the problems increases. Do you think that, for those problems, compute is still very much of a limitation? Or do you think that we're kind of getting to the point where any improvement is going to be improvements in our models or our data sets? And how do you kind of see that evolving?
I think the compute efficiency is important. I think that with more test time compute, generally the assumption is the model can always get better and better. So it might achieve kind of human level of visual design, but can it just invent new interaction paradigms, like new interaction patterns? I feel like that's more of a superhuman skill. And I do hope that with more compute, it will do that at some point. Yeah.
How do you verify at scale?
Start passing the mic to
My question is, when you generate synthetic preference data, how do you verify at scale?
Sorry.
let me
Well, the thing with synthetic data is that you don't actually need to generate a lot of it, right? So you can actually have like very much like manual inspection of what's going on. Obviously, you can think of other methods like ask human labelers to check the work. You can also ask another model if that model is like very well calibrated. So it's like it becomes a more like meta thing. Maybe you can have a meta eval for that model to verify what you want to like verify. And I think we are kind of entering those types of tasks too. But the thing with synthetic data and the data itself is like maybe you don't need as much. What's important really is diversity and diversity. Cool.
Just a follow-up question to that. What do you think about like the diversity and quality trade-off? So there's like been like recent code generation papers that they put instruction diversity as like how they prioritize it more than code execution quality. So like after filtering for code execution quality, it actually led to like a poor training outcome, which is very like interesting. So I was just like wondering like what your stance is on that.
Yeah, I think it actually depends so much on the like task and what you're trying to do. Sometimes synthetic data, if synthetic data happens to collapse certain mode, and then it will like actually be hurting your training. But if synthetic data is actually diverse, it might actually at scale. If you do a lot of RL on this, it might just like recover from this. It's hard to give you the right answer because it depends. Nice. Oh, another question.
Thanks for that. So I have a question that's about making money, I guess. So,
Okay.
okay, it's a real question though. Like we all know that serving large language models is expensive, especially at the scale that OpenAI, Anthropic are doing. And my impression has been that at the current stage, it's actually losing money to serve all these models to produce the products. Mm-hmm. Is that true, or what's being done to I guess bring down the cost?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think for a developer, I don't know. I think it's the question for Sam whether we are losing money or not. But I do think that the generality of the technology is like so wide that I think about like how to make money on a regular basis, so I don't know. But as a developer, let's say, and if you're using all the tools, you actually don't need to like create a foundation model now. Like you can just use very inexpensive, very open, DeepSeek is like very interesting results, right? So you can like bootstrap from existing research. I think it's harder to be at the frontier because you kind of need to like invent, and that might be expensive. Like when you invent something new, it's always inefficient, it's always expensive. But actually, it was every technological innovation. Like then what comes next, the second innovation is how do we bring down the cost of the thing that happened, right? And this is what's happening in AI too.
So is the
and then you can create amazing product, and this is how you make money.
Yeah. That's a good answer. Just quickly following up. So is most of the cost reduction coming from like infrastructure improvements, or can better models or better algorithms also contribute to lower cost?
Yeah, I mean like lowering costs, but I think it's the cost of production, maybe just, the cost of production of the model training itself might go down. Like it's the training process in itself might be not as costly anymore, but obviously we scale a lot. Like scale, it's very much like in linear relationship or like scaling and compute. I think it's just like, it's hard to know. I'm sorry, I don't have an answer to this.
Okay, thank you.
So how do you envision LLMs could be used in other fields such as robotics or embodied AI?
Oh yeah, I do think like future AIs will be building data centers or how the current LLMs in robotics. I think I've read like Pi, the company by Sergey Levin, like their paper, they're using a lot of like RLAIF, like RL for robotics tasks. Obviously, I feel like data is a huge limitation and bottleneck, but I think as long as you solve that, I think it will be really amazing. Yeah, I'm very hopeful and very excited about this.
Oh, hi. So you mentioned you work in both product and research. So I'm interested in, from the developer or the researcher point of view at Anthropic and OpenAI, what's the visibility for you into other components of the model, and how easy is it for you to learn, say, the pre-training of GPT while you are like responsible for part of the post-training?
Oh yeah. Well, I mostly worked on post-training side of things. Obviously, pre-training. Obviously, you just cannot run like pre-training on your own. You want to like be a part of like the next big like training run or something. So that's like part of the teams that you can join. And I think there's good visibility in like the steps around. And sometimes you want to contribute the data sets to them or help with certain like tasks that you're interested in.
So I was curious, do you have any coworkers who are AIs right now, and do you use like agents in a kind of coworker relationship right now?
I don't think I have like a amazing product to be like this, right? I think I use ChatGPT on a regular basis. Is it my coworker? Not really. Like sometimes I ask like, what do you think? But it's like in ChatGPT, like what I really want, I don't know if people have used this product called Tuple. It's a pair programming software, but then it's like, you can just call a model and then share screen, and then the model can just literally start like editing my code if I'm coding, or I can like highlight things and then the model can see it and change this. It's much more of a natural co-working form factor, but no, like I don't think we are technology-wise, like we are not there yet.
Do you have any ideas for like what's missing in having an autonomous like coworker partner? Because I mean, I've seen the cool, demonstrations here. I think there's a paper like a year or two ago on just like simulating like a city of people and all that. Like, what's the gap between that and so like a peer that you could have on Slack?
I think the gap is actually social intelligence and like some of the human things, like being able to like in real time like generate things that I'm asking, and then also being smart about things. Like maybe I want to code too, but like will the model be able to tell me, instead of like taking agency from me, the model can just like guide me through this. Or like it depends on like how you want to form this relationship. It's like really hard. So the model is, I feel like, is currently limited by the social abilities. Does it make sense? Like I think that's missing. Kind of like speech to speech conversation. Like can the model converse back with me in real time and then point to things that it talked about exactly at the same time? So it's like those type of things that possibly need like some of the changes in like architecture and like multimodality things. Yeah.
In your experience, which are the biggest differences between traditional product development and research-driven?
Yeah, that's a good question, because I interned briefly at like companies like Dropbox or Square, and they are mainly very much like traditional software product development, and they go through like this interesting life cycle of, okay, I have like PRD, I do this, I incentivize designers comes up with like UIs, and then I ask software engineers to do this. We have 2 minutes, I believe. Yeah, but I think with research-driven products, it actually comes from research. Like if the research has like an impressive demo of the model capability, maybe then then you shape the product around it. And sometimes it's like both product and research come together from the very beginning and do something. This happened with the Canvas, for example. Yeah, when both product and research were together, and there was like less of a process. It's like more of a ad hoc. Yeah.
And you shape it end to end.
Yeah.
One of the 3 questions.
For fundamental unverifiable domains like creative writing or visual art, have you thought about using the real world as an RL environment, social media virality, or competition results as a reward? Kind of like LLMs is. Yeah, it's interesting. I think, nobody has tried it. Like this looks reasonable. Yeah, especially with creative writing, you have all the like competitions or prizes that people got from their writing. So there's something in there. As someone who's still concerned with AI or stepping into the creative space, do you have any personal moral affliction on how your work is so powerful and that was other positive people negatively affected? I actually wrote a blog post about this. I have a blog post. It's called in Substack, and the post is called Moral Progress, and I think you will find it interesting.
All right, so give a hand again for Karina.